Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Mage Errant, Book 6, Tongue Eater, chapters 47, sort of, through 51. In these chapters, we touch base briefly with Hugh and company, but for the most part, what we get here is a battle and Alustin's plan. And I just keep being bummed out at how well thought through all of this is. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Dan for commissioning this episode. Dan, if you are out there, hello, sir, and welcome. So the end of the last episode, I had mentioned that there was technically supposed to be Chapter 47 covered, but that I had run out of time. I was already over by several minutes and I hadn't even started that chapter. So I'm going to talk about that one pretty quickly because it's a fairly short chapter. But Alustin is meeting with the Sarnassins, and it's actually it works out because this ties in with the next couple of chapters really well. And this is the meeting that he is in when he gets this surprise attack from the Havathi. So I'm just going to talk about this briefly. I already mentioned in the last one about how the Tongue Eater seems to really be gearing up and like doing some shit to him. And he has found some coping mechanisms that are not specific to the Tongue Eater, but for mental attack. And that like looking at an object and really zeroing in on it and just focusing so that you have a picture of it in your mind's eye is one of the techniques. And even though it's the best he has found, it only works half the time. It's not successful a lot of the time. And I just really thought it was interesting, like that kind of technique. It makes me think of the sort of thing you do during a panic attack when there's a technique that I can't remember exactly what order the senses go in, but I believe it starts with 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. If I'm not completely mistaken, I think. And it's just a way to like center yourself in the moment and ground yourself so that you are not caught up in the panic, like the feeling of having a panic attack. For those who have not had one, it's like a tidal wave comes over you, and it is this overwhelming sense of I can't do this. That's like, there's all different things that can trigger a panic attack, but in my opinion, like they tend to come down to, I can't do this. I can't do this right now. I can't do this. And you get so in your head with them. That's like the nature of them, that you completely lose focus of where you are, because all you can think about is what is worrying you, whether or not it's about, I'm about to go on stage and I can't handle this. I am, for me, it was always related to either money or dealing with the dogs. Really was a big one for me. I had a few panic attacks while we were coping with having all of these puppies because I was so exhausted and so overwhelmed. And that feeling of overwhelm is just, even if you haven't had a panic attack, people get what I mean by that. And so it's a means of like keeping yourself in the moment and not thinking about whatever it is that triggered you suddenly flipping out. And it can really, really help. Similarly, they have like patches and stuff that you can put on the back of your cell phone case that are really strongly textured. And it's for people who have like a sensory issue, like often need to center themselves using their senses. And it's something that you can touch that's really distinctive and like attention grabbing in a way that like stops you and causes you to focus on it. So anyway, I just thought it was interesting that this like mental attack thing, it seems like the same sort of objective. And Alustin is like, he had wanted to bring more people with him than he has. He hadn't been able to find an argument to keep most of the factions in his mage army from joining him in negotiations with Sarnassus. I'm sorry. No. He didn't want to bring more. He wanted to bring a lot fewer than he did. And he feels like this is just going to put them too much out in the open. Like when there's this many people, it's difficult to conceal them. He doesn't feel like the number of them is actually enough to like really defend if something happens. So for him, this is just sort of an irritating number. And there's a mention of High Vale, and the Valley Nation, it says, had firmly sided with the remains of the Coven, even with the ridiculous plague propaganda falling apart. And when High Vale didn't want a force crossing their territory, it didn't cross their territory. They might be lacking in terms of great powers, but their military was otherwise one of the most effective on the continent. But they're enemies of Havath, so even so, Alustin's just kind of like, well, we're still kind of on the same side. And Kiata is the other one that gets brought up here. Alustin was staying far away from the Lich's demesne. Kiata was involved with the same shadowy extraplanar organization as Kandaron and Havath. He doubted the Lich would take kindly to his mission, and given that Kiata and Kandaron had shared an uneasy friendship older than any Ithonian nation alive today, he imagined his betrayal of Kandaron wouldn't be met with approval, which I have got to assume is correct. And I really, I'm very curious if the plague, if that propaganda is falling apart. I really want to know exactly what it is that people are beginning to believe. Like, we know that there's just the rumor he has taken some other weapon, but there has got to be, I won't say a consensus, because there absolutely does not have to be that, but there have got to be a couple of major weapons that are being mentioned. And I really wonder what it is that people are talking about, because what you run into here is the difficulty with how many of the weapons were like an unknown quantity. There are some things that Kandaron had in that vault that people knew about or suspected were in there, but there's a lot of stuff that they aren't sure of. So I'm just really wondering what the rumors are turning into now. So there's also something interesting here. Surafan had fallen when Rhûn was conquered by Havath 50 years ago, just a few years after the assassination of Assem. And though it was common knowledge that the mirror mage who slew the Lich had been a rogue librarian errant, it was a far better concealed secret that the mirror mage had been responsible for the sabotage of Surafan as well. And this is one of the things that, because a lot gets mentioned in this chapter, that I am not sure how much I need to know any of this stuff. Not to say that, why bother putting it in the book? That's not what I mean. I'm just it gives flavor, and it definitely makes the world feel real and expansive. But there are a lot of people and powers mentioned that I am not putting a lot of effort into remembering, because I am assuming I don't really need this information for everything to make sense later. And hopefully that is correct. So this place, Illinois, it used to do a ton of trade with iron, and that really begins to fall apart, which causes basically this area to collapse. And let's see. Improving relations between Alakia and Sarnassus in response to Havath the expansion had reduced the number of Alakia merchants willing to cross the Green Mountains when there was a far easier trip they could make to the east. Without the money from trade, Illinois hadn't been able to pay the dirt and water mages to keep the river from changing course, and over the years it shifted its banks until its closest approach was over a league away from the city. And I was thinking it was going to be the river took over the city. But it turns out they are relying on this, and it's too far away. The final death blow had been an assault by Dorsasign, stripping the city of all its gold. The Phoenix Great Power hadn't bothered to conquer the city, but burned down a huge portion of it as he robbed it. So this is actually kind of a good example of the description. We had a talk, and I can't remember if it was this book or the end of the last book, but there was some talk about how wearing away at a powerful city is something that you do like slowly over time by fucking with trade and making just everyday living really difficult. And it's, changing where, or not changing where, I guess, the river is, that has completely ruined things for them in combination with the iron trade getting ruined. So, Ms. T is in the chat. Hi, Ms. T. When I read it, I treated it like the houses in A Song of Ice and Fire. And asterisk, it equals all the detailed history of great powers and politics. Yeah, I think that's a good way to approach it, where it's like, it's there. And maybe if he does another expanded story or, anything like that, I would come back to this and have a lot more appreciation for all this detail. But at the moment, it's sort of just there for atmosphere. So anyway, Alustin, he's not super stoked about meeting the Sarnassins here in these ruins in particular. But because it feels like they're sort of open, like they're too exposed, but also if they were to meet somewhere that there are a lot of people, it's difficult to move in the size group that he is without it being really suspicious. And this is when he gets the tongue eater like reacting, and he has to do his focus thing, and it works this time. So that's pretty much that chapter. And then chapter 48, we go back to Limnus, and Hugh is thinking about how he had thought the Limnan magic was going to be inferior to the magic from Anastas, which is funny because like this is the assumption that I made about Chemetria, and then turned out to be so wrong that I had sort of revised my feelings entirely by the time we got to Limnus. And I was just like, all right, they're absorbing so much magic or processing. I don't even know what you want to call this, that they are shape-shifting. That feels very serious to me. That feels like not necessarily like their magic is superior, but definitely equally as powerful if it can make those kinds of changes. And it was interesting to me that after what they like went through fighting some of the Chemetrians, that he hadn't also reached that conclusion. And we find out that there is a great power that comes to visit. There's like some sort of event. Evidently these happen a lot. This is like a place that does a lot of good-natured arguing, but also has a lot of celebrations. So it's kind of noisy. Like there's always something going on. But at this point, there are all these people shouting, and then a bunch of children are able to come out of their little protected area, which like never really happens. And there's a shadow cast over the ground that he is thinking is a monster at first. The creature was larger than the village itself, and Indra's Stormbreaker could have fit multiple times over into its bulk. It still wasn't as big as Ephirus, the massive storm jellyfish that drifted the skies over Ithos' jungle, but it was immense nonetheless. And eventually, he is able to get, because it's so big, he can't comprehend it for a second. It takes a minute. It was almost snake-like in shape, but far thicker proportionally than any serpent, and its tail branched out again and again until it had split into dozens of long, flexible tentacles behind them. The creature also had dozens of long, multi-jointed arms stretching out radially up and down its length. More than the thick forest-like fur, the constantly moving arms and tails, or the unsettling way its sides expanded, contracted, and rippled, it was its eyes that caught Hugh's attention. There were hundreds of them running up and down the creature, many of them bigger than Godric, and each and every one of those eyes was recognizably human. So Hugh here is like, wow, that is some real fucking shape-shifting. And Talia looks at him and is like, wait, no way, there was no way that was ever a person. And, it seems like, yeah, it is. Look, I'm not trying to say that there isn't some, clearly you are in this form and incredibly powerful. There are advantages to it, but I can't imagine choosing to go from being a person who can live in and amongst other people to having a form that causes me to be as large as the entire town and unable to really sit in and amongst other human beings anymore. That sounds like such a bummer. And I really wonder how much it's under any of their control, how they transform. Is this something that just happens in whatever way it happens based on a number of factors and you aren't able to determine ahead how it's going to go? Does it depend on the way that you absorb the magic and so you can sort of choose? I am really, really... I have a lot of questions about this. So they get gestured at to come with Kunin. I love that Sabe tries to make a joke and nobody laughs at it. I really feel for Sabe because that's not a bad joke. Kunin gestures for them and she says, is this some sort of let's feed the strangers to our giant shape-shifting elder ritual? No one laughed. You have any clue how it stays afloat? Godric asked. Sabe looked a little disappointed at the lack of response to her joke, but nodded. Sabe, I would laugh at your joke. Well, alright, I say that. Maybe not. I would smirk and acknowledge it, at the very least. It's not that bad. And she says that there are flotation sacks, but there's other stuff going on that she can't quite grasp. And Talia is like, I didn't think we were going to see any powers like this. And I don't know if you can even call them shapeshifters because it doesn't seem like this person can shift back again, which is fair. So all of them have to take a second to determine whether they're going to actually participate in this celebration because they have a lot of work to do, but they are really, they deserve a bit of a break. They just do. So they decide that they're going to head down there. And the Titan, as they are calling them, there's more than one. Another one comes along a little bit later, but it's got a melodious voice and it's overwhelming, but it's not as big as he was expecting for something the size of it. The next one that shows up, it was smaller than the first, no more than 400 feet long and maybe 30 feet wide. It looked like a centipede if every segment of its body was a yellow crab the exact shade of the mists above. The only reason Hugh even guessed that it was another Titan was the cheering from the villagers and the friendly waves the first Titan gave. And it has 6 eyes, and they are all human as well. So they decide to help set up the festival. And I love that there's a moment in here again where Mackerel tries to drop a fish, or succeeds in dropping a fish on Sabe's head. And she just looks at him and is like, bruh, you've done that before. Like, I get it, but you've got to face facts. You're just going through the motions now. You're not doing this for the fun. You're doing this to prove a point, and it's not really working. So we get some Alustin magic party prep here. This is pretty fun. The villagers had set up a barn-sized veil tent for the children to play in, where they were close enough to see and be seen by the 2 Titans. It was a fairly clear day, so Hugh is able to breathe mostly normally, but the kids still do have to stay in a protected area. Hugh and his friends still had no idea what the deal was with the masked Limnans. They didn't seem to be treated differently than any of the others, nor hold themselves apart in any way other than the masks. I wonder if this was an impromptu thing or something scheduled. A seasonal holiday, maybe? Does Limnus have seasons? Godric asked. And Hugh asks one of the dudes, and I was thinking to myself when he asked, like, oh, have they started to learn the language? No, they have not. Hugh asks and gets like an unintelligible answer and then just says, I don't know why I thought that would work. Which I could see sort of like falling into that where you forget that the people around you don't speak the language because you have gotten used to communicating with them in another way. And so it's like you're succeeding in communicating. I had this when I was living in Guatemala. It was an immersive program that I was on. So you were sent to live with a family, and you were not with your classmates or any other people from your school. And the point was to put you in a situation where you had no choice but to speak Spanish because the people speaking with you did not speak any English. And my Spanish was at the time, but I was managing. But there were times when I would just blurt something out in English because they were making themselves so clear, even though I had trouble understanding their, body language and gestures. I would just straight up forget we hadn't been speaking the same language, So we get a bunch of music and things go on into the night. The Titans seem to be like really happy with this whole thing. And they go and get some weird creature that they like split and eat. And nobody else other than our group seems to be at all like weirded out by it. It's just a matter of course. And there's a moment here where Talia points out this dude named Emgal, who is interested in Sabe, and he is flirting, but Hugh is like, I saw him making out with a guy like an hour ago. And Talia says, I think they're a little bit more easygoing about that sort of thing here. But just as she says that, the hunter walks up and starts yelling at Emgal. And he's like, oh, nope, never mind. Emgal's just an asshole. Sabe separated herself from the ongoing argument and made her way over to Hugh and Talia with an exasperated look. Was it really too much to hope that flirting would be less terrible and dramatic on other planets? And I did think that was really funny. Like, I appreciated that Talia is thinking, okay, maybe they're just like, more chill about having multiple partners or being interested in more than one person. And, you would be totally willing to believe that in a strange land that there would be a completely different attitude about relationships. But then no, it's just kind of somebody who's being shady. So we go then to chapter 49. And it has been 3 days that we are doing negotiations with the Sarnassins, and Alustin is beginning to get really, really bored. So to keep himself busy, he has been intermittently scanning the area around him with his seeing sense. And eventually he catches that they are going to be attacked within about half an hour. I thought they were a lot closer when he discovered this. But later on, when he's alerting everybody else, he says they have half an hour. And let's see, there's this guy named Styres who is the representative from Sarnassus. And apparently it's almost, I won't call it like a monarchy because they have multiple politicians. It's not like kings and queens, but it does seem to like travel down through family dynasties. And so Alustin is sort of prepared for this guy to be like a useless windbag. But it turns out he seems to have been chosen for like some decent reasons. And when Alustin says, do you want to retreat separately or consolidate forces? Styres is like immediately taking control, is considering everything. And he says, I remand control of my escort to you until we've escaped this attack. And some of the Sarnassins are like, what the fuck? But he says, look, this is a test. If you're competent with like managing my guys, then that'll show me something. I know you are supposed to be a good fighter, but that is not the same thing as being able to command other people. And Alustin is like, all right, you know what? That's pretty good. So let's do this then. So there are about 30 of them, and a full dozen of the Sarnassins were Griffin Rider warlocks, which would be considerably more useful. And we find out that Griffins have like an innate hatred of dragons. And a lot of dragons like go out of their way to avoid Griffins, which is a really like, this is just an interesting, the idea that it's an inbred trait. I say inbred, you know what I mean? It's bred, not like, you get what I'm saying? Okay. So yeah, here it is. The smaller creatures had been magically engineered millennia ago to fight against dragons by the enemies of the ancient Draconic Empire. So he's like, all right, we've got some more forces from Havathi than I was expecting. He had detected the first one, but there are like 3 more groupings, I think, that he hadn't noticed. And it's just they're outnumbered by quite a bit. So he says, all right, we are going to have to stay tight and fight. We can't flee. That's not going to happen here. And the dignitary is just like, dude, we're going to be, 6-1? Alustin says 8-1. And he's like, that's nuts. We should just turn you over to them instead. This is the dignitary, not Styres, by the way. When he says that, Alustin says, you can try, and Styres cuts him off. Can you handle the Havathi? Alustin looked him right in the eyes. I can. It's not going to be easy, and not without casualties, but we've had days to ready our defenses. Styres just stared at him as though looking for any sign of doubt, then sighed. Let's hope you're right. Alustin's opinion of the man went up considerably, and he nodded. So, this whole thing is so ugly, guys. It's so difficult in this situation because we're not meant to be like rooting for anybody involved. You know what I'm saying? The Havathi do seem like colonizing assholes who are conquerors and don't have a lot to recommend them. But Alustin himself is planning on doing something so monstrous. So it's like, I'm rooting for his allies, but they don't know what it is that he's actually planning. And thus I'm like up against a wall with that. And I'm wanting to root for them, but because he's So it's just, I had such mixed feelings about all of this. So let's see. He pulls out the relay golem, and this requires his mind to shatter into a dozen pieces to control them all at once. And this is a really wild thing. Later on, it seems like this is a problem because the tongue eater is going for those pieces separately. And I am extremely curious about what the deal is with that. But let's see. The relay golem wasn't a crude ambulatory weapon, nor some elaborate magical engine. It was fragile, and even a simple sword blow would be enough to destroy it for good. He'd been able to divide his scrying to focus on multiple scenes before. He'd never been able to handle doing so for more than a few seconds at a time. The relay golem had evolved into so much more than just a scrying aid. As he delved into will-imbuing, golem crafting, lich transitions, and even elemental creation, he'd realized he'd be able to do more with it than he'd first hoped. He'd been forced to imbue more of his will into the relay golem than was contained within dozens of his lesser origami golems, but his years of calculations had finally paid off. The relay golem was going to allow him to not just monitor the whole battle at once, but to command his entire force remotely. Beyond even that, it was going to allow him to split his magic and cast multiple spells at once across the entire battlefield. I'm sorry. I'm going to need to take a drink here for a second. That just seems really unfair. Every time we check in with Alustin, he has some new shit. And I, for one, am tired of it. Stop it, Alustin. Nobody wants you to win, and this sucks, and I hate you. And then, right after this, we get... And it was still only the fourth most ambitious plan he'd come up with for his combined affinities. I mean, look. The others, it says he probably wouldn't get to develop. But probably? I mean, I don't know. This is just really scary to me. And, he could theoretically do more than a dozen, but this is about as much as he can handle. 2/12 of his mind carried paper bands inscribed with communication glyphs aloft to distribute among both his own troops and the Sarnassins. 3/12 scattered inscribed paper across the city so he wouldn't lack for weapons anywhere. The remaining 6 focused in on the enemy, taking stock, counting numbers, and estimating arrival times. But one of those 6 didn't move or scan across the enemy forces. It remained focused on a single member of the enemy, one of their commanders, on a woman he'd not expected to see for weeks yet, Valia Warwell. And Valia, we get a mention here about how surprising it is that she is not in charge. I didn't think anything of it here. But later, when he notices that she looks nervous, and she's never looked nervous before, she's always been so in control of her expression and so focused and zeroed in, that was when I was like, yeah, that's not Valia. That's an illusion. That's definitely not her. It just didn't make sense for me because he's thinking like, oh, I broke something in her. And while I was in her head and I know that the last fight they had together definitely opened her eyes to who he actually has turned into, that is not the same as breaking something. And even if he had, I did not believe she would show that on her face. Like, it just didn't feel like her character. So it turns out, yeah, this is not her. It is an illusion. And she is meant to be a bit of a distraction, which is successful for a second. Like, this person who has taken her place goes down, and Alustin has a real moment of like, oh my God, Valia. And it's not until the mask begins to slip and he sees who's really under it that he is able to contain himself again. So this grouping of like the Havathi that are coming at them, all of the tactical incompetence is the way it's called. He is used to a certain attitude from them, a certain approach. And he is relying a little bit on them being cocky and overestimating their own capacity. So when it seems that this crew is actually being directed really, really competently, it's repeatedly an irritation for him. And I really enjoy this. Like, there is a certain satisfaction in an enemy who is incompetent, because of course it will make your job easier and it can make it feel like, see, these people do not deserve to be in charge. But when they are good at their job, oh man, really twisting the knife. The Dominion had clearly come prepared for him in specific. They had grossly disproportionate numbers of wind and fire mages, and even more alarming, they'd brought dozens of paper mages. They reached out with their magic and shredded his traps, wards, and ammunition caches scattered throughout the ruined towers. Alustin was far stronger than any one of them, but not all of them together. And in that moment, I was sort of like, oh shit, you know, I was feeling a little bit, I was thinking maybe he isn't going to be able to manage this as easily as he thinks. But he's so organized. This is frustrating to read, you guys. First, there are wire traps. And this is the kind of thing that it's an oldie but a goodie. All of these flyers, they're not looking out for them in wires. For those who are not who have never encountered anything like this before, it is crazy pants how much a strung wire can disappear in the air. Like, if there isn't light shining on it to give it a bit of a gleam, or if it's not made of the kind of material that does gleam. There is in my neighborhood, there's a park that has a pole that is held in place with two cables going down on either side of it. And it sort of makes like a tent shape. And the cables stretch out away from the pole, you know, at like probably a 35 degree angle. And I have at night been walking my dog at the park and have come so close to just clotheslining myself on this wire. And it would not it's not narrow enough to take my head off. It's, you know, it's a thick cable, and it's still almost invisible at night. Like, it's an inch thick. And nevertheless, I didn't see that until it was right in front of my face. So this thing with the wires, I mean, I'm thinking something like piano wire. Maybe you could get even finer than that if you've got metal mages who can spin it out. Like, that is so scary. There's an episode of Midsummer Murders where somebody puts one of those wires across a road because there is a dude they want to kill who rides a motorcycle, and he just straight decapitates himself. And it's really awful. So let's see. The fires were spreading rapidly as the Havathi flyers advanced into the city. The disproportionate numbers of wind mages were enough to keep the smoke from choking the Dominion forces, but the visibility loss was the most important result so far as Alustin was concerned. It didn't significantly block his scrying, after all. So, let's see. His forces had planted numerous alchemical explosives and other traps in the next ring in from the wire trap ring, and Alustin waited patiently for the bulk of the enemy forces to pass before he spoke orders to his mages with the ability to remote detonate them. It was hard to get a count of how many Havath died in the explosions, but he doubted it was more than 10 or 20. The number of injuries, however, had to be 5 times that. But they just keep coming in a very inexorable, that's the way to say that, manner. So he's got sharpshooters and they begin a bombardment. The classic sharpshooter mage was one with wind and wood affinities, launching arrows from enchanted bows at targets a mile away, and Alustin did have 5 of those. The remaining 9 that targeted the Dominion flyers were from the Librarian Errant and Starhold, both far more unconventional forces. Anders, the pyromaniac, a Librarian Errant ice mage, nailed a Havathi scout with an icicle from half a mile away. He was called Anders the Pyromaniac to distinguish him from Glacial Anders, a fire mage who had been killed by Heliothrax during the battle for Skyhold. Estella Skipshot took down 4 flyers with a single slingstone from a third of a mile away. She had no less than 4 affinities: stone, force, inertia, and wind. And while all of them individually were quite weak, she'd spent years practicing techniques to extend the range. She could send her slingstones an astonishing distance, bouncing them off targets and obstacles multiple times. Of all the sharpshooters, she was least likely to be discovered. Her slingstone ended up hitting her targets from almost the exact opposite direction she was targeting them from. And that's chaos. That's bananas. It's just small things like that that add up to total confusion. So let's see. The forces of the downed dragons weren't abandoned. Whoever was commanding sent 3 other dragons to pick up the survivors. At this point, Alustin was confident Valia wasn't the commander in question, even though that was absolutely her style. And I'm like, this whole thing, the fact that there's something happening that he admits is her style, that she looks nervous when she doesn't usually, I was like, something's up here. Something's up. So because there are so many Havathi, even when they are successful with their attacks, it's like a drop in the bucket when they take a grouping of them down. And let's see. The only silver lining was that the sharpshooters had, with his guidance, taken out fully half the enemy paper mages he'd been able to find so far, preventing them from shredding his glyph pages and traps throughout the city. He could still use paper scraps as weapons, but he preferred his confetti just a bit more lethal than paper scraps. And he knows that they would want to, try and find him, but there's no way they're going to take the time to search the city for him. And he's using the labyrinth stone to shield himself. And he's also thinking about how Mackerel might have been, it would be more effective, and that Mackerel is definitely more powerful than Hugh or any of his friends have ever thought. So Alustin issued the order, and the true defenses they'd prepared activated, not the paltry number of traps they'd used against the troops advancing inward. Clockwork crossbows triggered in response to magical signals, launching hundreds more wires across the routes the Havathi had already passed. Enchanted noisemakers activated by the dozens, filling the city with a painful din to drown out Havathi orders and spread confusion. Alchemical smoke bombs lit themselves and pumped out a wide range of toxic gases, ranging from deadly poisons and opaque fogs to fast-acting hallucinogens, which, that is a nightmare. That's a nightmare. Truly hate this. This is, for those who are interested, I'm going to be covering the Hunger Games with Rashawn, and the preview episode, which is where I talk with her about what she spoiled on already. That will be going up for patrons tomorrow. It's up on Spreaker as of right now already, because I need it up in order to get the feed approved by Apple Podcasts. But it is there is a part in the Hunger Games where a hallucinogen is introduced in the midst of the battle. And it was like an incredibly scary moment to read because there is no sense of what's real and what's not. And there's also, because of the like location and the control that the people in that place have over the surroundings that Katniss is in, you could see some of what she's seeing actually being real. And that's the thing with this is like, you have hallucinogens and you're also surrounded by people with really wild magic powers. I think like if you are getting hit with a hallucinogen in our universe, not to say that it's easy to tell because the nature of how these work is that you lose track of like your common sense and judgment while you're experiencing it. But there is a sense of like trying to hold on to what seems the most likely and most grounded. But in these surroundings, that's not actually any kind of litmus test for anything. You know what I'm saying? So anyway, that sounded so scary to me. Glyph pages and recombinant wards activated themselves by the thousands around the city. The Havathi paper mages had destroyed many, but far from all of them. Worse were the origami golems, though. Alustin had been manufacturing origami golems almost every single day since he was a teen, starting just months after the destruction of Helicote. It had been his first serious idea for how a single paper mage could destroy a city on his own. It had only taken a few months to realize why that wouldn't work, that there was no way to build enough to destroy the greatest city on the continent, even if he had a century to do so. He'd kept making them anyhow, though, because they were quite useful in the right circumstances. He'd found himself using most of them in various battles over the years. Half of his remaining supply had been used up during the battle for Skyhold when he hunted the sacred swordsman through the library. He still had tens of thousands left, however, and he'd distributed most of them among the Librarian Errant sharpshooters. When he sent the order to them through the paper headbands with the communication glyphs he'd distributed, they dumped them from their storage tattoos, and the golems spiraled in toward the Havathi through the smoke. Not just from his own storage tattoo. It wouldn't do to give away his location. For all the traps, all the explosives, and all the golems, the single biggest change to the battlefield was the wards. And I love that he's like, Hugh would really hate these wards because like they're inefficient and they don't contain anything that's going to like assist with them breaking down so that they're not dangerous to people over time. But who cares about that, right? So he activates them. And let's see, the trap sprung around the Dominion forces. The Havathi commander, whoever it was, reacted to the trap they'd forced their troops into with remarkable speed. It couldn't have been more than 30 seconds after the trap activation began that the Dominion forces moved. And in normal circumstances, the smart decision would have been to just obliterate everything in the path. The best way to disarm was to annihilate. This commander had another option, due to the fact that their army was made up entirely of airborne forces. Aerial forces were usually best as support for ground armies. Since this army was dedicated to hunting a smaller, highly mobile force, there was no point in being slowed down by ground troops. The Havathi didn't try to fight their way out at all. They flew straight up instead, attempting to rejoin the patrol force they'd kept above the city. At this point, Alustin couldn't stop the smile from spreading across his face if he tried. The first Dominion flyers to ascend died messily as they struck the horizontal wards projecting outward from the tower tops. Some were set on fire, others were frozen or electrocuted, but most just crashed headfirst into solid magical barriers, including one dragon. The rest checked their ascent immediately, but that came at a cost. For the first time, their defensive formation broke as they scattered in every direction. And before they get a chance to regroup, they open fire. we have a bit of a moment here that I thought was funny. If this were one of the terrible adventure novels Talia liked to read, the illusion wrapping the bulk of Alustin's army would have dropped, revealing the smaller force floating above the city center. As it was, however, the massed spells dropping down on the Havathi forces seemed to emerge from a huge cloud of smoke above the city. The overflight patrols immediately started winging their way toward the heart of the battle, but as they approached, they found out the hard way that the wards extended upward too. No less than 3 dragons crashed headfirst into invisible wards rising from the city below, and only one of them managed to regain control of their flight before crashing down into the city. Yikes. I really do enjoy how important wards are in this universe. This was something that sort of struck me for those who have read the Cradle series. It's not that scripting in that series becomes unimportant, but it definitely falls by the wayside in favor of sheer personal power. And I thought it was a little bit of a shame because I appreciated how much Lingen was able to accomplish initially when he didn't have any abilities, just using script magic. So there was a big part of me that kind of was like, I wish that we got more of that. He is still a creator, and he builds tools and weapons and constructs and stuff. So it's not like that part of his personality does not continue to grow and change. But the scripting specifically is a little bit like by the wayside. So I find it fun that this becomes Hugh's major talent that he continues to explore and get well known for. And I also appreciate that it's even it would be weird if he grew so well known for being able to do things with wards and other forces didn't take advantage of it. It's a kind of a common trope in a lot of fiction that there will be some not so secret weapon that a person is a main character is getting use out of, and for whatever reason the enemy sort of underestimates the importance of that particular power or object or method or whatever, and thus you can sneak up on them with it because they discounted it as being worthy of their notice. And that's certainly a valid way to approach it, but it does feel like you're making the enemy a little bit too foolish. And I like that, the use of the wards, that is not something that is new or special. The way that Hugh designs them is specifically what he's really good at. But the way that wards are implemented it is still hugely important in a battle. And I don't know, I just kind of appreciated getting to see that this is something that got taken advantage of with this group. Even though I don't want to be, once again, rooting for Alustin because, oh my God. But, it's difficult to not root for the person whose head you are in a lot of the time. It's a tricky thing. So then we have the griffins, who are the size of elephants. They were almost as sturdy as dragons, far swifter, had claws and beaks that could slice through dragon scale with ease, and had truly vile tempers and a hatred for dragonkind that had been bred into them by their long-gone creators. Even so, they'd been hunted to extinction across most of Ithos, and likely Anastis as well. The Athonian Empire had kept and bred a few. Bonding a warlock to a griffin made for a truly terrifying force, especially when the warlock was also pacted to a second source of magic. For whatever reason, affinities could be passed easily from warlocks to griffins. So when the griffins dove out of the illusions and smoke clouds at the disorganized dragons, they did so wreathed in fire and frost, lightning and force. One griffin even dove surrounded by a swarm of copper razors. And that sounds wild. Like, I know that the point of these affinities is that you can control that, but it just sounds so dangerous to me, you know? 12 Sarnassan Griffin riders weren't enough to destroy the Overflight Patrol, but in combination with the wards and smoke, they were more than enough to keep them disorganized. So they're still like managing to hang on here, though. Like, the Havathi forces are still quite organized, and Alustin is just kind of like, man, like, we're doing a good job considering our numbers, our planning and everything, but it's still just not quite enough. And then we have Alustin's forces had fortifications. They were all hiding atop massive stone blocks from the ruins, being levitated in mid-air. Stone mages weren't particularly known for the range of their affinity senses. The fact that Alustin was seated atop one of the floating stone blocks, contributing his labyrinth stone and anti-scrying defense, helped tilt the odds at least a bit in the right direction. And then it says, which was when Alustin's mind forcibly collapsed back in on one center of focus again. All 12 segments had lurched over to Valia Warwell. And this is when he thinks that she's gone down. And again, there's just a moment of kind of like, oh my God, I can't believe that this has happened. And it says Valia, who should have been his ellipses, should have stood at his side against Havath all these years. And I was like, should have been your what, bro? Was he going to marry her? Like, what? But anyway, he realizes that's not her. And then he sees that there are 30 flyers above the city coming down in a dive. So that's kind of fun, is that like, oh, if this were a bad adventure novel, such and such would happen. And it does, but it is not Alustin's people that it happens with. And the 12th shard of his mind is being totally dominated by the tongue eater. So the chapter ends with him saying, well, shit. And this just keeps getting worse and worse. So when we go into chapter 51, it's battle. And Valia is in the midst of this, and he tries to say something like, I didn't think I was going to be seeing you this soon. And she gets very irritated and is like, dude, can you just not do the whole fucking like conversation thing? We have given you so many chances. I'm not falling for it. And there are a couple moments where she gets in some shots. So I'm trying to get, because I'm running out of time here, so I'm trying not to go shot by shot here. But here it is. I've come to accept that you're a monster, but I have to admit, I was shocked you would go so far as to betray your master and your students. How much enjoyment did you take out of that? None, Alustin said. They aren't Havathi, after all. He tried to keep his tone light-hearted, but that one had struck home. And this is when he warns her, like, you're going to lose a bunch of forces if you don't back off on the advance you're doing. She does not listen to him. And let's see, as the Havathi dove at high speed, thousands of ink droplets erupted out of the paper scraps and flew into their faces. So it's just like meant to blind them for a couple of seconds while they get completely ambushed, basically, by all of these other sharpshooters and other soldiers. Only Valia and 5 wind mages survived the volley. I did warn you. I'm really not much for bluffing. And she says then, I've been wondering, before you betrayed your students, did you force them to address you as sir, just like your father did to you? Alustin didn't bother trying to speak to Valia again after that. Not just because he didn't want her to hear how much her parting words had shaken him, but because he was struggling to command the battle while fighting off the tongue eater. So I thought this was interesting because, the whole thing with Alustin telling Hugh, don't call me sir, and Hugh insisting on calling him sir, it really just felt like at the time, Alustin being like, no, I'm not like that. I'm not one of those teachers. I'm a cool teacher. But it turns out like there was a very particular trigger for him in that. And he, just kept it to himself what that was all about. But just knowing that there was something more to it is saddening, and it says 7/12 of his mind were under assault by the tongue eater. It was worse than it had ever been before, but Alustin doubted it was a coincidence. Something about the relay golem was actively attracting its attention. So his mind collapses into one yet again. The relay golem is destroyed, and then all of a sudden the tongue eater's assault completely vanishes, backs off entirely. And we do not know what it is that's drawing the tongue eater. I was sort of wondering if it was because his mind is broken into pieces that it feels that this is making him vulnerable and easier to attack, or if it's because the relay golems are like a means of communication and the whole thing with the tongue eater is communicating, you know what I mean? Means of communication in a very basic way. I don't know, but I find it really interesting. And, he is there with Celia, who sees this completely fold, pun intended, and she just is like, oh, sorry that your relay golem didn't work out as well as it should. You probably should have tested that thing longer. And of course, he can't say, no, it was the tongue eater. So he has to just sort of nod and go with the story that it is the relay that didn't work, which I'm sure kind of kills him because he's super proud of this invention. But for the moment, it's a very convenient scapegoat. The ancient superweapon in question twitched irritably, but it didn't seem further inclined to assault his mind. And that is how chapter 51 ends. So, I don't know, kids, I just really feel like it's a matter of time before Alustin gets chewed up and spat out by the tongue eater. He seems so sure he is going to be able to manage it until the day he uses it. And I gotta tell you, I don't see it happening. I just feel like the rate at which it has begun to fight against him it seems like it is increasing rapidly, far out of proportion to the amount of time he has left. So it surprises me a little bit that it seems to have genuinely either not occurred to him or he has been unwilling to acknowledge it when it has, that maybe this isn't going to be doable, the original plan. Maybe he has to come up with another way. But it doesn't seem like it has. He's going with it still. And I don't know, Alustin. It just feels like you are setting yourself up here, guy. And I'm not going to be sorry for you when it happens because you have been given so many warnings. So it's nobody's fault but yours when this shit really backfires. And I have to my main question then is if it backfires in such a, if it were to backfire beforehand, would other people be able to tell what had happened to him? Would it break free entirely and attack the rest of his army, or would it be restricted to only him? And if it were restricted to only him, would that change the approach of this army and the way they were handling the battle? Because they thought they were fighting for something that it turned out wasn't his agenda at all. Even if it doesn't take him over or completely cripple him in some way, it could just simply become known, which would, I think, really shake the people that he has allied himself with. And I think that changes the entire game. So anyway, all right, I've got to wrap this up, but very interested to see where this is going. So close to the end here. I think this is the last section of this book. Let me double check here. Yes, it is. The next chapters are the last ones, and then we go to the last echo of the Lord of Bells. Dun, dun, dun. So, my birthday is this Sunday, so I'm taking time off from recording. So it won't be until October 10th that I record that episode. So if you don't hear from me for a while, it is not that I am, slacking. Well, I am slacking, but it's purposeful slacking. It's birthday slacking, which doesn't count. So anyway, thank you guys so much for hanging out with me, for commissioning this, Dan. Appreciate you a lot. And I'll be seeing you soon with a new episode. Until then, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.